Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. The Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 12th of September 2023. This is the third time I've recorded this. Well, I got halfway through the first time and then my brain just had a brain fart and my MS got the better of me and I just started again. I just recorded the whole video and it wasn't recording. I could cry. Anyway, just to let you know, I think as a result of my time issues today, my second part is probably going to have to be a live stream because it's actually easier for me to do live streams. It takes me less time. So I'll probably do that for my second part. I've got quite a lot of geopolitical stuff to talk about. But in the meantime, let's do this, which is looking at the Russian, for the third time I'm going to talk about this, looking at the Russian loss figures as according to the Ukrainian General Staff. Take these with a pinch of salt. All the caveats apply, and you can find the caveats in the description below. The Russian personnel losses amount to 550, according to the Ukrainians yesterday, which is there or thereabouts for what we've seen for the last week. 8 tanks, 11 APVs, maybe not as high as some days, but still a consistent loss for the Russians, and they would not want to be losing, around 10 pieces of either tanks or APVs a day. That ends up becoming unsustainable. 33 artillery systems and 4 multiple launch rocket systems. These are huge numbers lost. Now, we can't expect to see visual confirmation of every single piece of this equipment lost. Right, 100 videos. The Ukrainian General Staff or the Ukrainian battalions working on the front lines don't have time or the need to put out 100 pieces of video onto social media. What they do is they put enough to give you a sense of what's going on, to kind of give you their narrative. And what we try and do is work out whether that snapshot is reflective of what is really going on and is supportive of what, in this case, the General Staff is saying. Same for the Russians as well, right? So do the videos coming out from the Russian side support what the Russian MOD are claiming? And we're going to talk about that in a second. So I think we can be somewhat confident in saying the Russians are losing a lot of stuff. Are they losing 33? Did they lose 33 pieces of artillery yesterday? Don't know. Is it plausible? Yes. Certainly possible. I'd say it's plausible. But even if you take 30% off these figures, the Russians are having a heck of a time. So instead of 33, they lost 22. That's a bad day, right? You could take a third off that, and it still represents a really bad day for the Russians. 4 multiple launch rocket systems, when they're used to losing about one and a quarter a day or something like that on average over the course of the war. To lose 4 in a day is 3 times as bad as it has been, and the same for anti-aircraft warfare systems. They lose less than one. They've lost less than 1 a day over the course of the war. They've lost 3. So again, that's 3 times worse than normal. So it's a bad day at the office for the Russians. 43 vehicles and fuel tanks and 4 pieces of special equipment. This is an absolute shocker. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something General Petraeus was talking about yesterday. There's a really good interview with General Petraeus. You will know him from Iraq and from being in charge of the CIA and whatnot. Really good interview on Ukraine Latest podcast from the Daily Telegraph. Go and check it out from yesterday. He talked about the model of the Ukrainian offensive here, which is stretch, starve, strike. And at the moment, we know that they've stretched the Russian forces, and the Russian forces are stretching themselves. It's just a mix of two. So Russians are doing these diversionary attacks up in the north, but the Ukrainians are able to contain them with the forces that they have in the area without committing counter-offensive resources to that front line. So the Russians have ended up doing a pointless diversionary attack that hasn't succeeded, but has attrited their own forces rather than having those forces operating on the south, which means that they are properly stretching the south, and they're having to bring reserves from other areas on it. So Novomyolsk, apparently you had reserves going, or troops, they're not reserves, troops going from Novomyolsk to Robotyne, which means Novomyolsk is now weak, so the Ukrainians can do a probing attack there and have some success. Kherson, they moved troops away from there to the front line, given that the Novokakhovka the Kakhovka dam exploded, and they thought, right, we can move troops away from there. And now actually it's got to a position where those troops are needed there. The Ukrainians have managed to stretch the Russians across the front line by doing these probing attacks, by still being operational around Bakhmut. So Bakhmut, the Russians really don't want to lose it, so the Ukrainians committed forces that were already there to doing a counterattack there, and the Russians rushed in a load of their own forces to defend there, and those forces obviously can't be used elsewhere. Although 76th Guards Assault Division, or units of, have been brought from Crimea and from Bakhmut down to the front, down to Zaporizhia, because they need those troops. They're just really stretched, right? So that's one aspect. So stretch, success, tick. They don't have strength in depth, the Russians, across the front line. Second element, starve. Absolutely hammer the logistics. From the Kerch Bridge, which is still not properly operational, Chonhar bridges, Henichets Bridge, they're hitting Armyansk and even Krasnoperekops today. There are explosions there, helicopters in the air. So the Russian logistics is pretty knackered. They are shipping in diesel locomotives to Mariupol to try and get the train lines working, because the Kerch Bridge is not operational for trains, and they're screwed, and Chonhar. So they can't go up via Crimea, so they need to get trains coming in from Russia through Donetsk, but then that goes around Volnovakha, which can be hit by artillery. So they're just screwed logistically. So stretch and starve, and then we go back to here and we look at 43 vehicles and fuel tanks being hit. They're using Bukanka Scooby-Doo vans to transport fuel to the front line because they're short of fuel tanks. They're in just a lot of trouble, and this fits in with the model. The strike part is really interesting because they did try and strike in a couple of big ways, and then they kind of pulled back from there. Okay, Robotna area, I think it's not massive strike, but it's kind of their biggest area of proper attacks. Velika Novosilka, they've actually pulled back. The successes in Novomayorska are from dropping off troops with MRAPs and APCs and IFVs, and then driving away, and then leaving the troops to do the work. And it's only a company or two of troops there. You look at what Budanov has said. For the most part, unfortunately, our counteroffensive is on our feet. According to him, ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and kamikaze drones have greatly reduced the effectiveness of the use of armored vehicles. So the Ukrainians are doing a kind of hybrid type of warfare. A hybrid version. I don't mean hybrid warfare as in information space and all that. I mean in terms of like trying to use aspects of NATO doctrine and aspects of their own kind of idea of how they should do things, because they started with some big attacks, lost all those big pieces of equipment and said, right, we can't do that. So we are now in this phase of stretching and starving, and also attrition of artillery, anti-aircraft warfare systems, logistics vehicles, and special equipment. So this phase is still ongoing, and it will take as long as it takes for them to starve out and attrit the Russian forces to the point where they can do major attacks involving, all the Challenger 2s and the Leopard 2s and the Abrams tanks and all that equipment they can bring to bear. At the moment, they're not using that equipment in large numbers, and we can see that in what the loss statistics are. So let's look at that. Oryx here says that the Russians lost 14, or at least they counted up 14 bits of equipment lost yesterday. They counted up one piece of equipment the Ukrainians lost, a Spartan, an older British APC, was destroyed. So that's 14-1. Now we'll look at Andrew Perpetua's figures, slightly different, but you get the sense that 5 tanks lost here, 2 T-72s, a T-80, and 2 unknowns, so heavily destroyed you can't tell. And then spread across the rest of stuff, you got some fairly big bits of artillery there taken out, and then we go to Andrew Perpetua, the mapper, who counts up all of the losses he finds when he's looking at the socials and all the video footage and pictorial evidence coming out. And he sees it more in terms of a parity. Yesterday, there's been a ratio that's much more beneficial to the Ukrainians over the last few weeks, but yesterday, a bit more of a parity. But actually, when you look at it, Ukrainians have lost a bunch of BMP-1s, so those are your lowest value infantry fighting vehicles, the oldest Soviet-style ones, Soviet-era ones. And then, again, it's MRAPs, MRAPs and IVs, really. So that feeds into the idea that the kind of attacks they're doing are using APCs and IVs and MRAPs to drop troops off, do small-scale probing attacks, look for a weakness and try and exploit it, but nothing too major. Whereas the Russians have lost, Grad, Muster, a bunch of tanks, BMP-2s, BTR, so a range of stuff going on there. You can add to that 6 boats, and that, apparently Hanna Maliar is now saying this from as the deputy defense minister, that the Russians lost 6 boats on the Dnipro River yesterday. So quite a lot of assets being lost there, and that's obviously good for the Ukrainians. Take that with a pinch of salt, though, etc., etc. Now, Nedsnow has done a really good analysis in one of the comments, or a few of the comments he's done on my threads. Really appreciate this, Nedsnow. Looking at the different lost claims from each side and the claims against visual confirmation. So he said that visually confirmed destroyed losses, Russia has lost going towards 4 times as many tanks as Ukraine. So you look at things like Oryx, how many tanks have we seen that the Russians have lost versus that we've seen the Ukrainians have lost? So 3.65 times as many tanks than the Ukrainians, 2.36 times as many armoured vehicles than the Ukrainians, 2.38 times as many artillery and mortar pieces, 5.8, so almost 6 times as many multiple launch rocket systems than the Ukrainians, 3 times as many helicopters, 4 times as many special motor vehicles than the Ukrainians. The ratio losses are high, are bad for the Russians. Now, you could argue about selection bias and why there might be more visual evidence coming from the Ukrainians than from the Russians, and that can explain some of the differences, perhaps, but certainly not all of that. It gets worse for the Russians as we go on and to look at some of these figures. Certainly for what the Russians claim, it's just utterly fanciful. So since June the 4th, so since the counteroffensive has begun, the Russians have claimed the Ukrainians have lost 18 helicopters and 2 planes. I mean, that's a lot of helicopters that we've not really seen, at least not 18, and an awful lot. Ukrainians have apparently lost 60,000 men since. I've got this the wrong way around. This is my brain going nuts again. I've read this 3 times now, and I've got my knickers in a twist. Ukrainian claims of Russian losses: 18 helicopters and 2 planes. So when we come down to look at the Ukrainian claims of Russian losses since the beginning of the counteroffensive, Ukrainians have claimed the Russians have lost, quite a lot of stuff since the beginning of the counteroffensive. In the same period, the Russians claim, in some of these categories, completely fanciful things. 35 Ukrainian planes have been shot down or lost since the beginning of the counteroffensive. 12 helicopters. Just where is the evidence of this? And actually, when you look at stats as of September the 10th, Ukrainian losses compared to the visually confirmed losses, so these are Ukrainian claims of Russian losses. So the claim is that the Russians have lost 4,554 tanks, and that's 3 times as many as been visually confirmed. Now, you aren't going to have visual confirmation of all of these losses, as I've already explained. You're just not going to have it. So that will be the benchmark minimum, the visually confirmed, but there will be more loss than that. So you'd expect there to be a difference. Is 3 times as many realistic? I don't know. 3 times as many APVs. 10.8 times as many artillery systems are claimed to have been destroyed by the Ukrainians of the Russians than we have visually confirmed. So that's a big difference, but wait until you come on and see the Russian losses, or the Russian claims of Ukrainian losses. And then 4 times as many MLRS, 4 times as many aircraft, that's fixed-wing aircraft, 3.5 times as many helicopters. Don't worry about the drones. There's reasons why that's going to be bonkers, because you don't get visual confirmed drone losses of drones that hit behind the lines and in Russia, and the same for the Russians in Kiev, for example. They're not going to be counted up. So 4 times as many vehicles and fuel tanks lost than is visually confirmed, right? But the Russian claims are nuts, and this is why I don't give you the Russian claims, because the Russian MOD, and therefore TASS that report them, is just bonkers. They are bonkers, those claims. 7 times as many tanks and other infantry, armored vehicles. 27 times as many artillery systems. So if we take 6,319 and divide that by 27, we come up with 234. So the visually confirmed losses of artillery systems are 234, and the Russians have claimed 6,319. It's nuts. Selection bias and all these other kind of components aren't going to explain the 27 times difference there. 36 times the number of visually confirmed multiple launch rocket systems. 7 times as many aircraft. That aircraft losses is just, the Ukrainians started the war with 236, I think, airframes. The Russians have claimed they've lost 467. They've lost double the amount of airframes they had at the beginning of the war. Yeah, they've been given a bunch of MiGs by Eastern European nations and whatnot. But that's not double. And like, if they'd lost that many, they'd literally have no operational aircraft. I saw footage today of Ukrainian airframes active on the front line. It's absolute nonsense. So Clive Engels, stop giving us TASS reports. Not bothered. I don't care. They're rubbish. 8 times as many 8.3 times as many helicopters as have been visually confirmed, have been claimed as lost by the Russians. 25 times as many special motor vehicles. It's just absolute nonsense. So that's why I don't give you the Russian claimed losses of Ukrainian figures. And unfortunately, there are no other stats to really go by other than the Oryx confirmed losses. And that's why I do that, right? Okay, talking about sort of losses, I'm not too much more on losses other than that, here's a T-80 getting destroyed by this is a $3 million tank going up in smoke as a result of a first-person view drone, and it does catch fire big time. And you're just thinking there is this asymmetry going on between cheap and plentiful and expensive and rare, and these tanks are getting rarer as we will see, because the claim is, and now take this with a huge block of salt, but I don't know the provenance of this claim. However, if it's at all true, man, that's nuts. 20% of all tanks currently deployed by the Russians are considered to be T-54, T-62 tanks. I've seen a lot more footage of this. I showed you some footage yesterday of 5 of those tanks and the camera crew going around and inside the tanks, seemingly proudly showing you these 60, 70, 80-year-old tanks or whatever. Just insane. Now, if 20% of the tanks are these deployed, then that shows that the Russians are in some serious tank issues, which I think they are. They're apparently saying that we're going to start rebuilding from scratch T-80 tanks. Whether they can remotely do that back in Russia, I don't know. Also, I told you this yesterday, after the special operation Sintia, which is the capture of that Russian Mi-8 helicopter, that the pilot surrendered, his family had been extracted from Russia to Ukraine. Helicopter crew were taken out, and then since that has happened, and it was on there was a documentary about it on Ukrainian TV. Apparently, according to the Ukrainians, take it with a pinch of salt, Russian military personnel are willing to surrender at an increased rate than before that incident. So 70% increase of Russian military personnel willing to surrender. So that even if it's half of that, that's really significant. Now, Russian helicopters are still pretty active. This is Bakhmut area now. Don't know the time stamp of this, and this might no longer be happening because a couple of these Ka-52s were taken out in Bakhmut fairly recently, as I reported. But anyway, a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter with Vickers anti-tank systems against the equipment of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So a BTR-4, which is an APC, came under attack. And what's interesting here, as this source says, is that BTR-4 is hit by the ATGM, carries on going and seems to be all right, actually, and then gets hit a second time. Now, we have seen even older Soviet-era BMP-1s get hit by ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and you think, well, that's the end of that. I mean, that's an old piece of kit. We talk about how good the survivability is of modern equipment like Bradleys and Leopards and whatnot. But actually, even in some of the older stuff, you see them get blown up, and then amazingly, people get out the back or jump off. You see an ATGM do a top-down attack with people sat on the top, blows up, and then those people, in the midst of a big explosion, jump off the top and run off. And you're like, how are you alive? So some of these explosions look quite catastrophic. They'll get a mobility kill. Do they get a catastrophic kill? Well, yeah, eventually, in this case, that's a catastrophic kill. But it doesn't necessarily mean the people inside die. It's just incredible how, there's going to be some serious headaches, and they might not be hearing very well for a long time. But it's amazing how people do survive. Right, departure of suburban trains has already been postponed several times. Some trains that were supposed to leave at 7:30 have also been cancelled in the suburbs of Moscow since some good guys, some saboteurs or partisans have burned another control cabinet. People were informed about the alleged repair work on one of the areas west of the city. This is, I think, fairly low risk, quite high reward stuff. Like these relay boxes are in quite a number of places and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and you could probably burn these without risking yourself too much. And yeah, it has an effect. Right, a massive fire at warehouse in Donetsk, occupied Donetsk, 4,500 square meter warehouse up in flames. I don't know if this is a result of a strike. I know Makivka and Donetsk are routinely being hit by artillery and other munitions, so it could be a result of that, or it could just be careless smoking, but that is a serious fire in occupied Ukraine. Right, and then going on to distant strikes, not too much to report in this section. Tavrisk, occupied Tavrisk in the Kherson region, there's a lot of explosions up and down the river there. Mainly it seems at the moment from the Ukrainians. Actually, it's kind of swapped. Kherson, the right bank of the river, or the western bank of the river, was traditionally a place where the Russians would hammer with artillery. I don't know if there's been all this complaints in the area that from Russians that the counter battery fire is ineffective from the Russians. So I don't know if a lot of the attrition of these artillery pieces that we read about every day are coming in the Kherson region. So you hear quite a lot about Ukrainians hitting Russian positions there, and less about, it was so routine that you heard like Kherson being hit itself hugely, and there's just less of that happening. I don't know, it may still be happening, but it appears that the news of that is less. The Russians are still using things like FAB 500 bombs, so there is that. Anyway, Kursk was hit yesterday in a drone attack. I'm not sure, the city of Rilsk, not sure what was hit there. And there is a fire at the moment in Sevastopol in Crimea. I don't know what that was a result of, but that's happening now. And Krasnoperekopsk has been hit. Powerful explosions heard there, and lots of helicopters in the sky. That is in this northeastern area of Crimea, so that is quite significant. And in fact, we'll stay on that kind of topic now. Since September the 10th, this is as of September the 10th, Ukraine's Southern Operational Command's spokesperson Natalia Humeniuk reported that Russia's Crimean bridge is still unable to function normally after the July explosion damaged the bridge. So we are seeing Krasnoperekopsk being here, as I said earlier, Chonhar, Henichevsk, Kerch Bridge. It's all hammering logistics. This is the starve aspect of this starve strike. And then staying on this topic still, as I kind of alluded to earlier, Petro Andriushchenko here saying, who's the advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, reporting in his Telegram, diesel locomotives were launched in the port. Alas, this is another sign that in the coming months, the Russians may be operating at a level sufficient to address the current logistical military issues. It is not for nothing that rotorcraft have been especially active in the last week, in particular, Kishki takeoff and land in the port. So the Russians have been moving stuff to Mariupol by sea, in this case to try and alleviate the logistical nightmare they have. They can't really use the trains to get, or the train logistics to get supplies through Crimea from Russia to Kherson on Zaporizhia. So they're trying to get diesel locomotives up and running in the Donetsk Oblast, possibly trying to get the railway line from just under Volnovakha operational. I mean, that is routinely hit because it's in artillery range, I think, from the Ukrainians. So yeah, that is what they're attempting to do. I don't know how successful it will be. This is pretty interesting development, says Intel Schizo. Russia is bringing in diesel-electric locomotives into Mariupol, which is a sign that they are establishing a new military logistics hub outside of Crimea that can better supply Russian forces in the southern region. Having such a hub increases the stability of the Russian logistics supply chain, which is currently fairly fragile due to the nature of having to go over multiple bridges from Crimea. Having these locomotives in operation also shows that they are confident that they can get these trains from the port closer to the front line with little risk of attack. So it's obviously going to be going forward another target for the Ukrainians to hammer the railway logistics wherever they're trying to set them up there and take out maybe those locomotives. But yeah, it is indicative that the Russians are in a bit of a logistical bind, which is itself reflective of the success Ukraine have had in terms of hitting supply depots, logistics hubs, the vehicles themselves, whether that be sort of trains, train lines, or fuel tanks and trucks. They're using Bukankas to get fuel to the front line, as I said, so Scooby-Doo trucks. So they're in trouble, logistically speaking, which shows that we need to shift our idea of what success looks like. It's not about square kilometers. That's the wrong metric because you're thinking about the wrong objective. The objective here is starve for the Ukrainians, and they're still in that phase. And so therefore, they are having great success in hammering Russian logistics. Now, they're also having success in using up Russian drones and munitions unnecessarily. So the CNN report has said that Russian troops have spent hundreds of missiles and drones destroying dummies. And the publication notes that the spectrum of dummies being copied is expanding, and among them are in particular D-20 howitzers, M777 howitzers, air defense equipment and radars. There are so many realistic ones. There are ones made out of cardboard boxes. There are ones made out of metal that they do everything but fire, ordnance. And you're thinking it's obviously cost effective for the Ukrainians still to produce metal fake howitzers. So they're doing that. But my thoughts would be that litter the whole of the front line with these. So that a Russian drone operator is looking at 100 of these things in a bunch of fields and thinking, well, which one's real? Of course, the Russians can do that too, right? Now, this is just another example of how Russia are regressing to a kind of rose-tinted idea of what Russia is. They're basically becoming the Soviet Union Mark II. All these men in dark suits there, look at them standing in front of this new monument to Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first Chekist and Stalin's most brutal executioner. I know, we'll put up a monument to him because he's cool, right? Was unveiled at the headquarters of the Foreign Intelligence Service in Moscow. It's an exact copy of the monument that was removed from Lubyanka Square in 1991. Removed because, hey, that guy was a bit of a douchebag. Oh, right, yeah, no, he's cool again now. Because the Russians don't have an accurate history curriculum for their children. People have a false sense of their own history. I've talked about this for the last year and a half. Like the Germans, and they've got a big long word for this, beginning with V. You Germans know what it is. That it was their kind of coming to terms with what happened in World War II. And they've gone through that kind of cultural psychotherapy, whereby they now understand the horrors of the Second World War and that really difficult acceptance of what actually happened. And they put things in place so that it will never happen again, right? Good on Germany for that. That's a really difficult thing to do. The Russians have never done that. They've never come to terms with what happened through Stalin's tenure, right? Through the forced famines and the genocides. They haven't come to terms with that. They don't accept that. So you can't get better from that. You can't make sure that's never going to happen again if you don't really realise it happened in the first place. When you've got a really bastardised view of your own history because you're always looking at it through rose-tinted glasses, when you've got propagandists on TV spouting nonsense that help to build up this completely false narrative of reality, then you're in trouble. Then you're going to end up putting up statues of absolute dingbats, of moral monsters. Put up a statue. Yeah, check that out. Aren't we awesome? No, not really. And here we have, it's quite interesting. So, a Telegram channel spotted ridiculous claims made by Russia in its illegal elections in occupied parts of Ukraine. So, they've been going through these elections where they're like, within 3 minutes of the elections opening, what was it? One of the regions had like 53% of people having already voted. What, within 3 minutes? I think these elections are false. Even Defense Politics Asia, in their title for one of their videos, had sham elections. So they understand that it's sham elections. If they're feeling confident enough to call them sham elections, then we know they're sham elections, right? Anyway, so one day, the head of the region, Yevgeny Balitsky, said, this is about Robotyne. He said, due to the fact that the settlement of Robotyne actually does not exist, the Russian armed forces decided to tactically leave it, said the head of the region. So he's saying, right, Robotyne is destroyed, it's rubble, there's no people living there, our soldiers are gonna leave there because it doesn't exist anymore. And a few days later, he's like, I'm talking about the elections. Even in Robotyne, even the residents of Robotyne voted in large numbers. Hang on, you just told us it was destroyed. It doesn't exist. And now they're voting in large numbers? Like literally a few days later. What are they doing? Crawling out their basement, like creeping through the rubble and saying, God, I hope the polling station's still open. I'm going to pop down there. Oh, whew, there's an RPG. Oh, whoa, hey, there's a bit of a mortar. Yeah, I'm going to vote for... Who can I vote for? United Russia or... United Russia? How about... Or United Russia, right. I'm going to vote for United Russia? Okay. I'm going to crawl back into my basement. Just jog on, Balitsky. Like, we don't believe you, but who is this for? Who's, like, believing this nonsense? We'll have Clive Engel in the threads going, I think you'll find really good election results according to TASS. Yeah, whatever. And then we have here some issues with the Russian information space. So in Donetsk, a car hit military blogger Gennady Dubovoy and he died. Dubovoy was once a warlord of the terrorist Motorola and betrayed Ukraine in 2014 and fought against Ukrainians in Mariupol and Severodonetsk. So I don't know whether he's actually a pro-Russian Ukrainian there, but he is no more. And indeed, we'll talk about, I'll give you a bit of analysis in this in a second. So worrying news about Mers, who is a Russian Telegram channel admin and volunteer of the 4th Brigade and so-called LPR. He is known for being close to evil Gherkin at certain times, as well as truth posting about the state of the Russian military on his channel. In other words, he's giving you something approaching reality in terms of what he's saying and the news he's delivering about the Russian military project. He had a conflict with his Prizhak battalion leadership, which got fed up with him spending millions of rubles on radio and comm systems to the 4th Brigade. For the 4th Brigade, they accused him of forgetting the battalion's interests and desiring to find favours from the brigade's leadership. Mers, who is a veteran of this war, announced that he will stop all volunteer work and it's hoping to be on the front line soon. Or is that, yeah, I hope to be on the front line soon, or it's like, yeah, I've been told I'm going to the front line. So, which is kind of perhaps a death sentence. So here we have the information space being constrained by the Russian MOD. You have evil Gherkin in prison. What for? For extremism. No, it wasn't. He was, well, yeah, it's extremism, but he was saying exactly what the Russian MOD are saying in terms of his opinions of the Ukrainians. However, he was just posting the truth about how badly the Russians were doing in the war, so he's put in prison. Here we got someone shut down. We've got 3 arrest warrants out for Russian mill bloggers in the Kherson area. I think Romanov was one of them. I haven't heard from him recently, so I wonder. I don't know if he's still posting. Some of you can let me know that. But why would this be happening? The only reason for that happening is if it's bad news for the Russians in this war. And it is bad news. They're not doing very well. And so the Russian MOD want to control the narrative. So they are shutting down people who are approaching reality with their reporting of the news. So, yeah, I think that's a reflection of how difficult things are for the Russians on the front line. Of course, it's difficult for the Ukrainians too, but there's this sense that people are being shut down in the Russian information space or arrested for saying things that are true. Anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate you supporting the channel. I need a cup of tea because I've now done this video 2.5 times and I'm fed up of talking about those same statistics. I'm such a loser. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.